Welcome. Today, you're at the session for Walking the Tightrope, and I want to thank all of our local sponsors. We really appreciated the opportunity to work on this session for you, and we couldn't do it without your support. My name is Maggie Smith, and I'm from Philadelphia Insurance Companies. I'm the event manager for this session, and I'd like to introduce you to Kim Menninger. We want to make sure Kim has the most time to deliver her session today. So very quickly, Kim is a certified executive and leadership development coach, holds degrees and certificates in her field, and one of her passions is making sure that women develop their leadership skills in their career choice. Today's session will consist of Kim's presentation along with polls and a question and answer period at the end, which we are really looking forward to. Again, I want to thank our sponsors for their support and welcome Kim.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and thank you all for being here today. I am really excited to have this conversation with all of you. And I will share very personally that I had my own experience with walking the tightrope years ago when I was working in a corporate environment. So the strategies that I share with you today, the conversation that we're going to be having is very personal to me as well. And it's very much my goal to ensure that you walk away from this session feeling like you have some very specific, actionable steps that you can take when you leave here. We're going to talk today about what we mean by this concept of the tightrope. We're also going to talk about why it's important for us to be here today, having this conversation together. Like I said before, I want to share some key strategies with you, and I want you to just be thinking about how you can apply them to your own personal situations. You'll see Q&A here listed at the bottom, but I want to keep this session as interactive as possible. So feel free to share your questions as we're going through the presentation, and I will stop periodically to respond to them as we go. So what do we mean by the tightrope? And some of you may be familiar with this concept, some of you may not. So I want to take some time to just give you an overview of what that concept looks like. And the tightrope is really this concept of having a very thin line that we as women in particular have to walk between being likable and being respected. So it's very much rooted in gender expectations. We have in our minds, and this is based on years and years and years of social conditioning. So a lot of this is happening at a very unconscious level, an expectation that we as women will behave in certain ways. And when we step outside of those expectations, it makes people uncomfortable, or there may be some backlash. So I'm not even talking about, I'm going to be speaking about gender here in very binary terms because that is evolutionarily how we have adapted these unconscious biases. So know that there's a lot in between. But when we think about traditional female behaviors, we tend to think of things like collaboration and warmth and empathy and really caring for others, not being as individually motivated. And when we think about leadership, we tend to think about traits such as being decisive, being confident, taking charge. And because that's not what we expect of women, when someone who's a woman shows up that way, there's a disconnect that, like I said, might make us feel uncomfortable. And so there is this notion that I, as a woman, can be likable if I adhere to the traditional feminine stereotypes that are expected of me, but I won't be seen as respected. I, on the other hand, can show up in more traditionally leadership-oriented traits, but I will perhaps be respected and seen as competent, but not be likable, which will hold me back in other ways. Now, when you think of traditional male stereotypes, we think of things like being decisive, being confident, taking charge, right? All of the same traits that we associate with leadership. So these biases reinforce this idea in our minds of leadership as male. And this actually hurts everybody, not just women, because you can imagine that there are a number of men who also tend to lean more towards traditionally feminine leadership traits like empathy, like collaboration. And there's a recent study that showed that 68% of CEOs were afraid to show empathy because they thought they would be less respected if they did. So this is something that is affecting all of us, regardless of gender. And it's unfortunate too, because we are living in a moment in history that is really primed for more of what we associate with more traditional feminine stereotypes like empathy, like working together. And if we continue to perpetuate some of these stereotypes of traditional command and control, take charge types of behaviors as the only leadership behaviors that we value, then everybody loses out on having a full spectrum of leadership traits. So this is also referred to as the double bind. And I'll share a quick image here from Catalyst that I really like because I think it sums it up nicely with this quote here of damned if you do, doomed if you don't, right? Too soft, too tough, never just right. We're going to do our first poll question now. So if we could launch the poll. And I want you to take a moment to think about whether you have ever experienced walking the tightrope yourself. So take a moment there and please respond to this question no matter how you identify gender-wise. I think it's important for us to have a full spectrum of responses. So I'm seeing some of the responses coming in. And of course, a lot of this will depend on the environment that you're in. So it may not be the case that you feel this way today. It may not be the case that you always feel this way. But in general, have you experienced this throughout your career or throughout your lifetime? Interesting. Wow. All right. So I'm watching the results coming in, and it looks like we are bouncing back and forth primarily between yes all the time and yes on occasion. Those seem to be the most popular answers, with yes on occasion really rising to the top. We've got a few I'm not sures, some no not reallys. Right? But it looks like overwhelmingly yes on occasion and followed by yes all the time. So let's move on. And I want to talk a little bit about why we are here today. So I am a women's leadership coach, and I specialize, as Maggie said, in really empowering women to become more confident, more visible, and more influential leaders. And one of the things that I struggle with personally is that in my efforts to support women to becoming more confident leaders, I never want to give the impression that I'm trying to fix women. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face today with some of the diversity and inclusion initiatives that are out there, with some of the conversations that we're having about gender equity, is oftentimes the solutions that are being proposed tend to lean towards, well, if women were to just be more confident, if women were to simply show up differently, then problem solved. And that is not an appropriate response to the problem. Women are not the issue, right? The issue is a lot of very deep-rooted structural and systemic challenges that are not maliciously intended. I think we're just trying to determine as a society how we're going to address some of these challenges. And in the process, there are some things that I think we as individuals can do to empower ourselves. My philosophy is that absolutely the system needs to change, that there are forces outside of our control that are influencing our experience in the workplace. However, if we ultimately decide that it's up to the powers that be, so to speak, to solve the problem, we give up our own power. So where does our power lie? Our power lies in what we can control and how we show up and how we address the specific challenges that we are faced with in our workplaces. So that's where I really want to focus today, with a recognition that obviously there are things that need to change around us. What are we specifically empowered to do differently? And the way that I see that is, if we are going to empower ourselves, if we are going to navigate the complexities of the environments that we belong to, we need to have a clear understanding of what those landscapes look like. And personally, I mentioned I worked in a corporate environment for roughly the first half of my career. And I remember when I first joined, I was young, I was naive, and I remember thinking, what's everybody talking about? I don't feel like I'm treated differently as a woman. I don't see what all the fuss is about. And then as I began to progress through the ranks in my own company, I started to see things that made me feel differently. And because I didn't realize that that was coming, I had this rosy view of how I was being treated and what the experience was like for everybody. It was that much more painful when I encountered it. So I'm not suggesting that we be paranoid. I'm not suggesting that we take a more negative view of the environments, but I do think it's important to understand the reality of the world that we're living in today, and to be prepared for the possibility that you may not, even if you don't feel, you may not feel this way today, it may show up at some point down the road. And the more that you're prepared for it, the better you can manage through it. It's also important to understand ourselves, because if we want to walk this tightrope, or we want to ideally rise above the tightrope, we have to understand who we are and how we want to show up. And so what I feel that leaves us with is two primary choices. The first choice is to strategically adapt. And what I mean by that is, whenever you're in any situation, that you understand the audience that you're surrounded by, the values of the particular culture, and that you choose what you're going to prioritize in terms of your own behaviors and your own style. Now, some of you may think of this as inauthenticity. I would argue that there really is no such thing as 100% authenticity in the workplace for any gender or for anybody at all, because we're always filtering ourselves. We're always adapting to whatever the situation requires in the workplace. So this would be similar to that. So if, for example, you tend to be a little bit more reserved, but you know that you're stepping into a meeting with people who really value bringing ideas to the table and being more vocal, then you might, while it might not necessarily be your favorite thing to do, you might show up a little bit more vocally for this particular situation, right? So that would be a strategically adapting. The other option, which I have in quotes here, is the idea of being yourself and letting the world catch up. And this is something that came up when I was listening to a couple of podcasts right at the same time. So I was listening to, I believe it was the Harvard Business Review Women at Work podcast, and they were interviewing Sally Helgeson, who some of you might recognize as the co-author of the book How Women Rise, which is a really great book about some of the traps that women fall into in the workplace. And she told a story of how years ago she was working for a manager. And when she first started working for him, they were coming out of a meeting, and he said to her in a pretty accusatory tone, "You know, you really speak your mind, don't you?" And it was clear to her that that was not a compliment. And she simply owned it. She didn't apologize. She didn't get defensive. She said, "Yes, I do." About a month later, she overheard him talking to somebody else. And he said, "You know what I really like about Sally? She really speaks her mind." Shortly after I heard that conversation, I was listening to Brene Brown's podcast, Unlocking Us. She was talking to Glennon Doyle, and one of them used this expression of be yourself and let the world catch up. And I thought that was a perfect way to capture what Sally Helgeson was describing, that at the beginning of the relationship, when her manager didn't have a lot of context for how she behaved or what she valued or how she was going to perform, when she was not adhering to the traditional stereotypes that we talked about previously, it rubbed him the wrong way. But she stayed true to herself. And once he got to know her better and realized the benefits of that style, he began to respect her. So that's another option that's available to all of us as we're navigating the environments that we belong to today. So I'd like to turn now to our second poll question. And here I want to ask you, and this is not something that you may have thought about before, so just, off the top of your head, would you say that when you're navigating your particular environment, you're generally someone who strategically adapts? Do you prefer to be yourself and let the world catch up? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And I think it's important to note here that this is not neither one of these is a one size fits all strategy. You can be making the decision about which approach you take in every micro moment that comes up for you in your workday. So it's something that I think is really important to be conscious of, because you have more choices available to you than you might think you do. And I'm looking here at the results coming in, and it looks like the overwhelming response here is I do some of each. That's about 56% or so. And then it's about even here with I generally adapt, or I generally prefer to be myself and let the world catch up. All right. Well, thank you so much for your responses here. Let's move on. We're going to talk now about key strategies. Before we shift, I just want to see, are there any questions out there right now that I should be thinking about? Okay, so it looks like we don't have any questions, but I will remind you that you are welcome to share your questions at any time as we're moving forward. So let's go back to the strategies. And I want to start with raising your self-awareness. And I alluded to this when we were talking about, sort of the idea of if we want to be ourselves and let the world catch up, we have to know what that self is. And oftentimes we lose ourselves in the environments that we operate within, because as humans, we are hardwired to want to belong. We want to fit in to the environments around us. And when we feel different from the people around us, there is a tendency to feel self-doubt, to feel self-conscious, and that can interfere with showing up authentically. So especially if you are a woman in a traditionally male-dominated field, if you are a person of color, that's one of the only, if there's any aspect of you that makes you feel different from the people around you, there's going to be some fears that if you stay true to who you are, then that difference is actually going to cause you to be perhaps alienated from the group or judged. These are all things that we at a very primal level fear as humans. So we want to, most of the time, just fit in, do what we need to do to not stand out from the crowd. But I'll share with you a personal story too. So I grew up in a family that moved every 2 years. My dad worked for the car industry, and it's just as we'd start to get comfortable in one location, we'd move on to the next. And so I spent most of my childhood in a constant state of transition, trying to read the room, trying to understand what are the values of this particular social setting, right? Because there's nothing more terrifying when you're in middle school or when you're a child than not fitting in. And so I would really observe and examine, what are people doing? How are they behaving? And what does that tell me about how I should behave? And I think that this kind of behavior follows us into the workplace, right? We learn to do this as children, and my situation is perhaps a little bit more extreme than some others of you who may not have had the moving experience, but it's still the case that we're always trying to figure out, what is the social circle looking for and how can we show up in the most effective way. And what I always found was that if I chose to show up in a way that I thought was what other people expected of me, like I said, I'm trying to calculate in my mind and I'm reading the room. And so I choose a behavior that I think other people are going to appreciate and they don't, that it backfires in some way, that is far more painful to me. It feels like, oh, I miscalculated. That isn't even what I wanted to do, right? Than it is if I stay true to myself. If I know that I'm being true to my own values and other people don't like it, or, it rubs people the wrong way, I still have that sense of assurance in myself that, okay, yes, maybe they didn't like it, but that's who I am. And so I think that's a really important consideration for all of us as we're trying to navigate this tightrope is, who do you want to be? What do you want people to say about you when you're not in the room? How do you want people to experience you? And to really think about how that aligns with how you're showing up today. What does that gap look like? Would you say that you're primarily in alignment behaviorally, how other people are experiencing you, with how you want other people to experience you? Or are you finding yourself putting on a persona because it feels like that's what's expected of you? Now, that, like I said, is part of strategically adapting, but you have to know where the line is between strategically adapting within a particular situation and really being somebody that doesn't feel comfortable for you, being somebody that doesn't feel true to you. And what you may end up finding is that this is out of sync with the environment that you're in. You may find that in order for you to be who you want to be more true to yourself, to be yourself and let the world catch up, so to speak, that you have to take a closer look at whether you can do that in the environment that you're in today. And that's a difficult decision to make. I'm not going to oversimplify it, but it is really important to think about, because if you have to behave in certain ways that are out of alignment with your values, with your natural style, in order to advance within your organization, what's going to happen when you get there? What's going to happen when you get to the next level? The pressure's just going to be higher. It's never going to get easier. So it's really important to take some time to reflect on who you are, very honestly, who you want to be, and whether you can effectively do that where you are today. The next strategy is to manage imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is central to all of the work that I do because it's so pervasive in the workplace. And this epidemic of self-doubt really undermines our ability to achieve our full potential, to achieve the goals that we set for ourselves. So be mindful too when it's imposter syndrome that's getting in the way of your ability to show up to be your best self. And this is a conversation that we could have all day long. So I'm going to, for the purposes of time, just give you a few insights and strategies to think about when you think about your own experience with imposter syndrome. Number one is to trust yourself. This is obviously easier said than done, but companies don't give you jobs as a favor, right? Your natural tendency when you experience imposter syndrome is to feel like this is a fluke. I don't know how I got here, but at any moment, people are going to figure out I don't belong here. I'm a fraud, and I'll be exposed, and some catastrophic consequence will happen, right? Trust yourself. I once heard somebody say, I believe it was Carla Harris, she said, if you don't trust yourself, trust the people that made the decision to bring you there, because they didn't make a mistake. Trust them until you catch up and begin to trust yourself. So that's step one when you're struggling with imposter syndrome. Number two is to really understand your purpose for being there. And I'll share with you that I used to work in the high-tech industry. My background is not in high tech. I studied psychology when I was in college. I always wanted to be a psychologist. I thought I'm going to go into a PhD program and be a clinical psychologist. So I never had it anywhere in my mind that I would join the corporate world. But after a couple of years out of school, I realized I wasn't in a place in my life where I could realistically take on 5 additional full-time years of school. And so I pivoted, and it was the peak of the dot-com boom, and companies were hiring, and it didn't really matter what your background was. And I got this opportunity to join a high-tech company. And when I joined, I was pleasantly surprised that my psychology background actually served me pretty well. But I was so intimidated by the technical people around me. And what happened was, because of my soft skills, I was promoted very early on into a role that I now had to interact on a regular basis with engineers and product managers and other people who, when I was sitting in meetings with them, I literally felt like they were speaking a foreign language. I felt like, oh my goodness, I am one question away from this entire house of cards just collapsing and everybody realizing that this is a sham and that I don't belong here. And it was so painful to me. I can remember just the chronic anxiety that came with that. And I thought to myself, this is a problem I need to solve. What am I going to do about it? And my first instinct was to go back to school. That's sort of my response to everything is give me the textbook, let me just learn it. And I thought, oh, simple as that. I'll just go get a master's in software engineering, problem solved. Of course, I took 3 courses before I realized that was not going to be the answer. But what I did after that was I sat down with our executive vice president of engineering. And I said to him very honestly, sometimes I feel in over my head in some of these technical conversations. Do you think I should go back to school and get an engineering degree if I want to advance within the company? And he looked at me like I had 2 heads and he said, get an engineering degree? No, you don't need an engineering degree. You are surrounded by technical people. If you need to have a technical conversation, bring a technical person into the room with you. You don't need to know everything. You just need to know what you don't know and build relationships with people who have that skill set. And I remember leaving that room thinking 2 things. Number 1 is, wow, what a relief, right? I actually never promoted myself as a technical person. Nowhere on my resume does it say that. I've never talked about myself in those terms. So it's not like I'm lying to anybody, yet they invite me to these meetings anyway. Yet they hired me anyway. It also made me think, then there must be another reason why I'm here. If it's not to be technical, what is my purpose for being here? I was a relationship manager. So my role was to make sure that we were honoring the terms of our relationships, that we were collaborating together. And I was able to make this really powerful mindset shift to recognize all of this time I've spent wasting on comparing myself to the people around me, trying to be someone that I'm not, trying to compete with Bob from engineering, who has 20 years of experience that I will never have and quite frankly don't want to have. I have been neglecting my primary purpose for being in this room. And when I could do that shift, when I could realize, you know what, I'm not here to know all of the ins and outs. I'm here to represent the partnership. All of that weight was lifted off of my shoulders. And it allowed me to show up much more authentically. I could then ask questions without feeling like I was exposing myself as incompetent. I could engage in conversations with a lot greater confidence and a feeling that I had value to contribute. So I want you to think about how that might be showing up in your experience as well. Because if you're experiencing self-doubt, if you're experiencing that feeling that I don't belong here, you're going to do things like fly under the radar. You're going to question everything that you think or say. And that's not going to be helpful in navigating this sort of conundrum that we're talking about here, right? Of really being yourself and showing up in the most powerful way. I just want to see if there are any questions at this point. Ooh, lots. Okay. Do you find it's different when in a junior role versus a senior role? Any recommendations for exerting confidence aligned with career growth? Thank you, Renee, for that question. I do think it's a little bit different for different reasons, right? I think there are actually pros and cons to each of those scenarios. When you're in a junior role, oftentimes there's a lot of pressure because we are newer, we are less experienced. And if you have imposter syndrome or you have that pressure that tells you I need to know everything, I need to do everything, it can be overwhelming because it's simply not realistic to have the same experience or same access to knowledge and information as somebody who's been around for a lot longer than you. So I would say embrace the junior role. Nobody but you expects you to be perfect. Embrace that time when you are early on in your career or early on in your role to ask lots of questions, learn as much as possible, own the fact that you are new. One of the things that I always say is go on offense rather than on defense when you don't know something or when you're new to something. So often we have a tendency when we don't know something or we're feeling uncomfortable with our level of competence to apologize, to show weakness. So we might say something like, for example, I'm so sorry to ask you this question. I know I should know the answer to this, but, right? That way of framing the question presents you in a very different light than if you say, hey, can you remind me what this means? Or I want to bounce something off of you. If you take ownership for what you don't know, people are generally not responding to the content of the question that you're asking. They are responding to how you're presenting yourself. So I would think about that too when you're in a junior role, is own what you know and ask for what you don't. And then I would also say that from a senior perspective, I think that's where competition really starts to come into play, where social comparison comes into play, where we start to say, do I know enough to be here in the room with all of these other people? Am I keeping up with my peers? Am I on the right track? And so I think that's where I would suggest just really trying not to get distracted by what other people are doing. Everybody's on a different path. It's easy for us to make assumptions about people based on what we see externally. A friend of mine always says we compare our insides to other people's outsides, right? So make sure that you're consciously reminding yourself of that as you are making these kinds of comparisons that are undermining your confidence. Let's see. The ability to show up as you are is also heavily dependent on the amount of privilege you may have. Absolutely, Shannon. I am really glad that you said that. I mean, this is a very complex conversation. And I'm not, I'm here for 1 hour to try to give you as many insights as possible, but there are a lot of intricacies to this discussion. As we continue to progress as a society, my hope is that there will be more and more environments that embrace us for who we are and don't continue to put us into boxes based on expectations of how we're going to show up. I do think, like I said before, thinking about how we can personally empower ourselves, a lot of that comes down to, am I in an environment where I can do my best work? And if not, what choices are available to me? Yeah, Donna, you're absolutely right. There's a generational component to this as well. We have all learned different ways of navigating this based on the time in which we showed up in these workplaces. And so it may be a different experience for people who are just entering the workplace today than it is for people who have been in the workplace for much longer. Is there ever benefit in strategically adapting to be able to advance and then make the changes needed within the organization when you are in a more senior position? Absolutely, Susie. That's a great question. So I do believe that in order for there to be the kind of broad scale changes that we're talking about, we need more diversity at the top. And so there are going to be these kinds of unique pathways that everybody takes to get there. And if strategically adapting feels like something that you're comfortable doing, it feels like an appropriate way for you to grow within your career so that you can get to a place where then you can leverage your influence to create more changes for others. Absolutely. Let's see. How do you describe the difference between leadership development and women's leadership development? That's a very good question. There isn't a difference other than the fact that for the reasons we're talking about, women have a different experience. And there are often times when women who show up as in those stereotypical ways that we're talking about as leaders face backlash that men don't. And so when I think about women's leadership development, I think about it through the lens of what makes it hard for women and how can we address those unique challenges and empower ourselves to navigate them more confidently. But it's not as simple as dividing it up that way, right? Because like I said before, there are men who would find themselves facing very similar challenges as well. And there are a lot of different dimensions of our identities that influence how we show up in the workplace. So certainly women's leadership development is one angle, but it's once again a simplistic one. Let me see. These are some great questions. I'm so grateful that you're coming through with more and more, but let me just go back to the slides for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to the questions. So this next this next strategy that I want to share with you is one that was personally very helpful for me. Self-promotion, and once again, I'm generalizing here, tends to be more challenging for women than it does for men because of the stereotypes that we're talking about. We don't expect women to show up as agentic. We don't expect women to show up and advocate for themselves. We don't expect women to be confident and assertive and decisive. So when we see that in other women, even if we are women who value those behaviors in other women, there is a part of us, because of this unconscious bias, that might feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. And because self-promotion tends to be very much aligned with self-advocacy and being more agentic, acting on your own behalf, self-promotion behaviors can be a sticky place for women. And I think oftentimes when we are thinking about self-promotion, many of us recognize that our work doesn't speak for itself. We're going to have to give voice to what we're doing to make sure that other people know about it, especially when we're working in virtual environments. We have this idea in our head, a caricature in our head of what it means to self-promote. And it's usually that, obnoxious guy that's tooting his own horn and everyone's rolling their eyes. And we are so sure that we don't want to be that person that we end up on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And we sort of undermine our visibility and we sell ourselves short. So what has been helpful for me is to think about self-promotion not as self-serving, but as a service to others. And what I mean by that is that when you are hired into your role, you are hired to solve a problem, right? You are there because you bring a certain combination of skills and strengths and talents and capabilities that your company is hoping you will use to contribute to achieving the larger goals of the organization. And if you come into your role and you don't share these skills and talents and accomplishments with other people, then you deprive them of the opportunity to take advantage of them. So for example, you could have the answer to a question and somebody else is trying desperately to solve that problem or answer that question, and you're making their lives a lot harder. So if we look at it as, I'm not here to stroke my own ego and talk about how wonderful I am. I'm here to let you know what I'm working on or what I have as a particular strength, what I'm good at, so that you can leverage that if you need somebody who has complementary skills to the skills that you have. That's a very different way of showing up. It makes it easier for us to do it. And it also makes it much less likely that you're going to receive backlash in response to that behavior. So in order to do that, it's really important that you know your value, that you really understand what are those skills and strengths that I have to be able to provide to other people. And one way to do this is to ask yourself a few questions. So number one is to ask yourself, what do other people come to you for? And if you think about that over a broad period of time, as well as in both your professional and your personal life, you're going to notice patterns. So if everybody comes to you with the same kinds of questions, that's a pretty good indication that they think you're an expert in that area, or you are their go-to person for these kinds of problems or these kinds of questions. If you're not sure, keep tabs for a week or two, write it down. And then look at what are the trends that you're seeing, right? So if you find that everybody's coming to you to ask you questions about a particular software application that you're using in the office, then you might decide, you know what, I'm going to be more proactive in showcasing that I have this skill. So maybe you'll put together a cheat sheet, or maybe you'll say, I'm going to have an informal lunch and learn because I've been getting a lot of questions about this lately, and I thought it might be helpful to share this with the larger group. So anyone who's interested is welcome to join us, and I'll walk through some of the key steps on how to use this. And you can do that with anything that you do well, is you can find a way to coach or teach other people. Another question you can ask yourself is, what comes easily to me? And for women in particular, we have a tendency to underestimate what comes easily to us. We tend to think that in order for it to have value, it needs to be hard. It needs to be challenging. And so we tend to look around at other people and we think, oh, what that person can do, that's amazing. That's really special. That's really valuable. But what I can do, nah, anyone could do that, or that's no big deal. But what you can do easily is something that somebody else is looking at you and thinking, I could never do that, right? That's how our brains work. So keep track of the things that you can do virtually in your sleep, right? What are the parts of your job that come super naturally to you? I guarantee you, like I said, that that's not going to be the case for everybody. And then finally, I would ask the question of, what do you really enjoy doing? What are you passionate about doing? What do you lose time doing, right? So you sit down and you look up, 2 hours have gone by and it feels like it's only been 5 minutes. Those are really important too. While they may not necessarily be areas of mastery, they're areas that you feel really strongly about. And so they're likely to be areas of strength that you will continue to hone over time. So if you start to get really familiar with what are those things that you do well, then you can repurpose that when you're working with other people. Another strategy that I highly recommend is that you start a practice of keeping an accomplishments journal. Write down, every day, every couple of days, don't go more than a week because you will not remember, but write down everything that you're doing, celebrating problems that you solved, accomplishments, successes. It doesn't matter how small it is, just write it all down. And what you're going to find is that it has very practical benefits when you have to do your performance evaluation or update your resume or justify a raise or a promotion. You've got all of that information at your fingertips. But beyond that, what it also allows you to do is it allows you to have a relatively, it's obviously not objective, but it's outside of your own head, right? This document that you can go to when you're feeling self-doubt, when you're questioning yourself, and to go and look at it. And you're not going to be able to chalk all of that up to luck, right? You can't look at pages and pages of successes and say that's a fluke. It also is like a gratitude journal. So the gratitude journal, if you're writing down every day what you're grateful for, you're literally training your brain to scan the environment for the positive, which leaves a lot less bandwidth for the negative. If you're writing down every day what you're doing well, then you are training your brain to think about yourself through a more strengths-based lens, which is going to influence how you show up, right? It's absolutely going to influence how you engage with other people and how they respond to you in return. And then what you can do is you can use this information in an effort to be of service to others. So another strategy you can use is to look at the work that's in front of you or look at the recent accomplishments and ask yourself, who else would benefit from knowing this? There's got to be somebody else in the organization that doesn't know that you're doing this, that might be trying to solve a similar problem or may want to look at it through a different lens. For example, if you're collecting data, analyzing reports, if you're building relationships, if you're using best practices, anything at all that you are doing as part of your everyday job is likely something that someone else doesn't know about and could benefit from it. And so if you reach out to people from the, in a spirit of service to say, hey, it occurred to me that I've got all of this information that might be useful to you. Would you be open to sitting down with me for 15, 20 minutes and walking through it? And we can see if there's a way for us to collaborate together a little bit more closely. It doesn't really matter what the outcome is, because what you're doing is you're taking advantage of an opportunity to educate somebody else on what you're doing, and you're building a new relationship. And it may not be the case that they have a need immediately, but you've established a foundation with them. And over time, you never know when the situation may change. So look for those kinds of opportunities. You can share updates in an email. You can share updates in a meeting, right? All of those can be really great ways to build your influence, to show up with greater confidence, to expand your visibility in a way that, once again, is much less likely to trigger the kind of backlash that we see when we experience that kind of caricature that we have in our head of, oh, aren't I so wonderful, right? Look at all the great things I've done. And then finally, build trusted relationships. If there were one sort of silver bullet to this whole issue that we're talking about, it would be building relationships. As I mentioned earlier on, when I was telling Sally Helgeson's story, the difference came from the relationship, right? A lot of times people are judging us based on one comment that we make in a meeting, one interaction that they have with us. They have no additional context for who we are or why we're behaving in a certain way. And so it's really important to give people the opportunity to get to know you in more three-dimensional ways. Anybody that you're working with on a regular basis is a prime target to get to know at a more personal level. And this is common sense, right? We all know that the more that we humanize the relationships around us, the easier it is to work with people, the more trust there is. But a lot of times we feel like we don't have enough time, right? Oh, I'm so busy. I'll get to that later. I've got this long to-do list. I would argue that this should be your highest priority job activity, because the more relationships you have, the more information you have access to, which will inform whatever work you're doing. The more people and resources you have available to you when you have a need for help in getting something done. The more fluidity there is in your interactions, the more influence you have over decisions that are being made. When you are investing in relationships, you are making a long-term commitment to your own growth within the organization, and that is going to pay off in all kinds of ways, right? And so when people know you in, let's say, personal ways, let's say you talk to them in a friendly way, you know that they have kids that are the same age as yours, you know that you have similar interests of some kind, right? There's a feeling of affinity there. We feel more connected. And so we're, like I said before, we're much less likely to then go into a meeting where they maybe get a little bit more emotional or they express frustration over something and think, wow, that person's a jerk, right? No, we're much more likely to say, oh, wow, that person is usually so calm. If she's getting really upset about something, it must be something important, right? There's different ways that we will interpret that if we know the person, than to make our entire judgment about them based on that one interaction. So one of the things I would say as a strategy for this too is to build relationships in neutral moments. And what I mean by that is oftentimes if you work in an environment that has a lot of pressure, a lot of deadlines, or you have cycles to your work, and so you're interacting with certain people only at times when everyone's hair is on fire and you're snapping at each other and you just need to get things done and it feels like it's an us versus them. After that dies down, reach out to some of those people, pick one, reach out and say, hey, you know what? I realize the only time we ever get to work together is when we are at each other's throats trying to get things done at this particular time. Would you be open to having coffee sometime? Virtual coffee is great too. So we can get to know each other a little bit better. And maybe we can even find ways to minimize some of the conflict the next time we find ourselves in those situations, right? There's a lot of great ways that you can reach out and build relationships with people that allow you to establish yourself as a human, and will dilute a lot of these natural tendencies that we have to make snap judgments of people based on these little micro interactions. So I'm going to go back to the questions, but before I do, I really want to invite all of you to stay connected with me. We are just scratching the surface on this topic. There's a lot more where this came from. So if you want to stay connected, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I share a lot of content related to these kinds of themes out there. Just feel free to reach out to me in any way if you want to continue the conversation. But I will go back for a moment to the questions so we can keep going on these. Let's see. Oh, I like this. Someone once said to me, don't compare your beginning to someone else's finish line. Yeah, that's a great mantra. I would put that in a sticky note and keep it in front of you at all times. Let's see. Finding allies in self-promotion can be very effective. Absolutely. Find a self-promotion buddy or a group, right? Where you're advocating what they're doing and they're advocating what you're doing. That can be really helpful as well, because it doesn't require you to be the one who's always delivering that message. How can we impact behaviors that minimize women's roles in the workplace? Yes. Oh my goodness, Brooke, great question. So I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that most people who ask for these kinds of things aren't intentionally malicious. But the effect of their asks, right, undermines us, or it can often make us feel like second class citizens. So it's really important to recognize what the factors are that are going on around you. So I was actually having this conversation with my husband the other day because I had a client who said the CIO asked me to take notes in the meeting, and that was really, kind of embarrassing to her, and she felt like that was undermining her value in the discussion. And so I was asking my husband about it as someone who works primarily with men. And he said, well, is she the most junior person in the room? Because if you're the most junior person in the room, it doesn't matter what your gender is, you're going to be the one that takes notes. It's happened to me. It's happened, So I said, okay, well, that's a good point. So I would say look around at things like that to see, are they singling you out? Also for patterns, are they always asking you? Right? Or are they diversifying and asking other people? Because one of the things that you can say is, I'm happy to do it this time, but let's rotate, from now on so that it's not always the same person doing it. Why don't we, just start a rotation or something like that? I think that can be a way to handle it as well. Let's see here. So, recommendations for how women can approach or address microaggressions in the workplace. This one, I feel like we could spend another hour talking about, but I'll just kind of give you some quick responses to that. I think this is probably one of the greatest challenges, because in some ways there's some gaslighting that happens here too, right? Because we've all been in situations before probably where we've reacted to something and then people say, oh, you're so sensitive, or you take things so seriously. I was just kidding. And so we can't even trust our own judgment sometimes about how to interpret somebody's microaggression. And that leads us to pause and hesitate and wonder, is that appropriate? Is that something that I should be reacting to? I will say this is really, really difficult because there are often power differentials involved. This is a place where we can all work together. It's really hard if you're the woman in the situation and someone says something to you to be the one to stand up for yourself. If instead we all committed to each other, we're going to be on the lookout and we're going to stand up for each other, then if someone, someone is experiencing a microaggression and you're watching it, you can say, that's not cool, right? Or you can shift the focus and try to help the other person out. And it'd be great if men were to do this as well. It's most effective when the most senior, most powerful person in the room is the one to step in. Now, again, there's another dimension to this too, is do you generally find that this person behaves this way and they're just kind of a bad actor? In which case, I think it's appropriate to publicly say, that's not cool, right? And to say, we don't tolerate that kind of behavior, whatever the appropriate language is. If it's somebody that just maybe fumbled and is generally, you think someone who wouldn't engage in that kind of behavior, that might be appropriate to take offline and say, I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but this is how this came across. So there's a lot of different complexities to this, but I would say don't leave someone hanging if you see this, right? It's so much harder to be the person in that situation than to be the one as the observer that can step in and help. Let's see. Women are too direct, but male counterparts use similar tones and words, are go-getters. How do we stop painting a target on our backs? Yeah, this is the tightrope. Exactly, right? That, what used to drive me crazy was when I worked in corporate and women were emotional and men were passionate, right? I literally watched the men around me throw temper tantrums. I've seen them punch walls. I've seen them throw chairs, and that was passion. But if a woman cried, that was being too emotional, right? So I do think one thing to think about is and I haven't found a better way to capture this, but to essentially narrate what you're doing, because it's not a bad thing, I would say, to be more, let's say, aggressive or be more emotional when you're delivering a message, because we want to differentiate. If we always had the same robotic tone, then we would never be able to convey when something's more important than something else. But what you could say is, you may be hearing me get angry right now, and that is because if we don't pay attention to this, we're risking X, right? And so to really narrate the reason why you're showing up emotionally so that people can connect your emotion to a business reason and not automatically assume, oh, it's the hysterical woman, right? And similarly with being direct, right? Is I want to make sure that this point is clear. I want to make sure that we are not neglecting this very important issue. When you do that, you bring the attention back to the issue at hand and not to how the style that you're using to convey it. All right. Wow, these are such great questions. Let's see. A lot of you are asking really great questions that I think are a little bit more personalized. Please reach out to me. I would be happy to answer your questions offline. Connect with me on LinkedIn or email me. Let's see. At a previous job, I was told my working style was too challenging and too friendly. What is the best way to challenge someone applying contradictory views? Okay, we have a few more minutes. This is a great question because this is a point I wanted to make and didn't do earlier. One of the challenges that we are going to face, and this is true across the board, but particularly for women, is feedback, right? There are a lot of people who are going to give you feedback that is indelicate, that is inappropriate, that is just frankly not useful. And a lot of that comes in these kind of gendered coded language of you're being too direct, you're too aggressive, or you're not taking up enough space. That's something I hear all the time from the women I work with. You're too quiet. You need to be more outspoken. Here's my philosophy on feedback. First of all, there's a great article in the Harvard Business Review called The Feedback Fallacy that talks about the fact that feedback is inherently biased because it's filtered through the lens of the person delivering it. It really doesn't tell you as much about you as it does about what the person who's delivering the feedback values, right? So remember that when you're getting feedback, and that not all feedback is created equal. I got feedback when I was in corporate from my boss who brought me into his office and said, you're an A player. I want to make you an A+ player. You need to be more of a bulldog. And I remember walking out of that room and thinking, oh no, I was super proud of the fact that I wasn't a bulldog. I thought of myself as a diplomat, somebody who could get things done without being aggressive. And now here he is telling me that in order to be a star performer, I have to be someone that I'm not and behave in ways that I don't value. And so what I did with that is I actually ended up making a shift to another group. But what I wish I had done, and what I would advise all of you to do, is when you get this kind of feedback, it isn't really useful and is very stereotypical, is to ask the question, what outcomes would you be seeing from me? What benefits would there be if I were to show up as a bulldog? And what that would have hopefully brought the conversation to is what am I not doing? Like, for example, if he said, well, what I mean by that is you need to not be so nice so you hold people accountable, right? Don't let them get off too easily, something like that. I'm just making that up. Then I could decide what's my most natural way of achieving that outcome. It may not be being a bulldog. That's who he is. That's what he values. But if he thinks I'm not holding people accountable, I can get there in a way that's more natural to me. So think about that when you're getting feedback, right? Is really try to get it to a more actionable and more business-oriented end so that you can then decide, is this feedback I value and want to work on? And if so, what's my way of getting to the outcome that they're describing? So it looks like we have about 30 seconds left. I just want to thank everybody. The questions are wonderful. I wish we could spend even more time going through them. I hope everybody will take at least one nugget away that will be helpful to you when you return to your roles. And once again, please feel free to stay connected going forward. So thanks again.